This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Dr. Mayumi Keiko works at Flinders University's School of Nursing and Midwifery Disaster Research Centre as a research assistant. She completed a Master of Nursing, it's focusing on nursing since the 1950s in Japan, and then a doctoral thesis on nursing professionalisation in South Australia since the 1950s at Flinders University. One of her current research interests is the Spanish influenza in South Australia. Based on her nursing background, she's especially interested in looking at the recovery phase of disaster and how oral history can be used to preserve personal and community memory of disaster. Her paper is titled "The Use of Oral History to Preserve Community Disaster Experiences. Is there an ethically optimum time to conduct oral history?" Please welcome Mayumi.
Usually I have to set up my mic, so I'm very short. My presentation is only 10 minutes, so excuse me to read my written script. Basically, my presentation is about when I decided to do oral history with nurses in Japan. I have a lot of objectives struggling, so I'd like to reflect on this experience to think about what I can learn to approach to these affected community and people. Yeah, thank you. I'd like to start talking about the impact of disasters as my presentation introduction. Disaster means a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or society involving widespread human, material, economic, or environmental losses and impacts which exceeds the ability of the affected community or society to cope using its own resources. So it is an environment which overwhelmed and society cannot cope with. And it is still new memory. There was a Black Saturday in 2009, Queensland, New South Wales floods 2010 and 11 in Australia. Internationally, there is the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake, which resulted in a nuclear disaster in Fukushima Prefecture. The impact of a disaster affects all functions in society as people's life, and it usually takes a long time to recover from this damage. Recovering in this context is not only about recovering from the financial damage, but also psychological aspect of affected people. The oral historian needs to consider this situation to conduct interviews with people in the community affected by disaster. Norris et al. 2002 of empirical review of the disaster victims for 10 years between 1981 and 2001 found that 77% of the disaster-affected population had some sort of psychological problems, such as post-traumatic distress, anxiety, and panic disorder. Knowing these impact of a disaster on people, I was questioned how can we ethically conduct oral history after disasters. So, by setting the background of this presentation, I'd like to set two objectives for this talk. Firstly, to discuss what ethical approach to conduct the oral history interview, and secondly, I'd like to reflect on my experience and to learn from this experience. After the 2011 disaster in Japan, I was planning to conduct interviews with nurses who are working at hospitals where the nuclear power plant had meltdown. It was 2 years later of the disaster. I have contacted with a key person who knew an academic working in Fukushima. The response from our key excuse me, from a key person at a university in Fukushima was that interviewing these nurses would make guilty, and it wouldn't be ethical if interviewing makes a particular to feel this way. So, so I had a difficulty to conduct interview, even the contact with the nurses. So after this first contact, I want to reflect what factors influenced on this situation not to have oral history interviews. I think about four factors. First, the psychological burden for nurses. Guilty is a feeling that if you did something wrong, then the nurses do something wrong. It is true that some nurses left work in Fukushima due to there was a fear of nuclear material exposure in the area, especially nurses who have young families. For this reason, if nurses had an interview asking about their experience, this may cause these nurses to feel more about their helpless feeling about the situation. And secondly, societal burden for nurses. Although it had been 2 years since the disaster, the nurses may feel that talking about the situation is still taboo. I also consider that the public movement of closure of nuclear power plant in Japan was also an influential factor for nurses to reflect working in the environment close to the nuclear plant. And also, I think this is one of the biggest factors to influence not talking about what happened is a cultural consideration. Japanese culture considers being silent is a cultural virtue. Talking about what happened to the personal or professional life is not preferred. And lastly, it was also anticipated that it would be difficult to locate where these left nurses were after the disaster. So before I was consulting with key person, I was thinking that 2 years after the disaster, nurses could be free from this feeling and could accept interviews. But the reality was not easy as I expected. Further, I was wondering that we do not hear about nurses' voices who are working in front line in this disaster, although the media attacked the head of the hospital, which was located within the evacuation zone, as he was claimed that his disaster evacuation management was poor, resulted 55 patients lost their lives during the evacuation process. My original intention was to interview nurses who were working in the hospitals located in the compulsory evacuation zone to ask their disaster experience on the day. How did they cope with the situation as a person and as a professional? Can we learn from their experience as well as I was expecting nurses to feel better about what happened to accept? Expecting the therapeutic effect on psychological aspect. Although my key contact suggested not having an interview, I was thinking about what was appropriate approach since. If I have asked the same question after 5 years, would this be same result? If I was more careful about selecting participants and changing the aim of oral history, for example, asking how they are coping with the current life, rather than asking about the nurses' experience when the disaster happened. OHA 2005, who conducted oral history with nurses who worked after the Hiroshima bombings in 1945, claimed that her project was aside in the past, these women were politically and socially oppressed and were unable to freely tell of their experience. 60 years later, she feels, Japanese society has changed and that younger generation might be ready to hear about the devastation of the atomic bomb and the role of war relief nurse during the disaster. Over 60 years, nursing in Japan has changed tremendously. Nursing education system, nursing credential system, healthcare system, and enormous technology development. All of these has changed and influenced on nursing profession. Nursing profession is more visible in society and recognized by society comparing to the time when the atomic bombing happened. When I consider her paper, nurses in Fukushima may still have both complex mixed feeling of burden of being a profession and an individual who lived there. I also questioned about the selection of the possible participants. If I change the focus of nurses to nurses who decided to remain in the area to continue working, would this approach possible to interview nurses? Learning from this experience, I'd like to summarize 2 points from my experience. Firstly, really need to understand clearly the factors influencing a participant, and also protecting the participants' rights, whether they would like to participate or not participating. I think in this, my experience, I couldn't really have a direct contact in Fukushima who are working as a nurse. So it may be different experience happens if I have someone known as a personally, maybe I can contact or talk about. So that is another object for me. Thank you very much.